For my first decoration, I decided to make something quintessentially Halloween. I found this cool pumpkin design and got to work. I started with a simple UV sphere, added a subdivision surface modifier, and then shaped it into a rough, pumpkin-y kind of shape. Then I grabbed every other loop and pulled them inward to make those classic pumpkin ridges. For the face, I started with a single vert, which you can do by enabling the Mesh Extras add-on, and traced the outline roughly by extruding and snapping my vert to the image plane with my reference on it. I added a subdivision modifier and did a bit of vertex beveling to tighten up some corners. Then I applied my modifier stack, filled the faces, and extruded it. I then used this as a Boolean object to cut the face into my pumpkin. Much easier than doing it with a dull kitchen knife. For the stem, I extruded out a cylinder, separated it, and used the basic brushes to sculpt it to look more gnarled and spooky. With that wrapped up, I used one more Boolean to cut a cylinder out of the bottom for an electric tea light so it'll light up and glow on the inside, which I think will look really cool when it's actually printed. Last, I checked for any issues, made sure it was a single hull solid mesh, and sent it to my printer. Personally, I use a Bamboo Carbon X1, and it's honestly super nice. It works better than my regular inkjet printer, which is wild considering it's printing in 3 dimensions instead of 2. For any of you at home who don't want to do the modeling part of this project, I'll be making all of my model files available as a Gumroad download for free, and I'll link that in the video description. Subscribe and ring the bell for free stuff. For the second of my decorations, I wanted to make something a little more complicated but still approachable. After a bit of reference browsing and surfing on the ocean of AI slop that is now Google Images, I decided to make a bit of a joke out of it. So I came up with this Rip Bozo design. Fantastic art, I know. I started by modeling the basic shape, starting with a plane and extruding it until I had a silhouette I was happy with. Pro tip, if you want a really strong model, it can help to put a holdout on it, which you can do by pressing this button, and see what the silhouette looks like. If it's recognizable as what you're trying to make just from the silhouette, you're probably going the right direction, especially with stylized stuff. Then, I took a pass at adding some damage. The nice thing about this being 3D printing and not game or film assets is the topology didn't matter as much, which is nice for me. So my damage was mostly just cutting inverts and edges and beveling them to create cracks and chips in the outer part of the model. I paid extra close attention to the outer edge so that silhouette ends up really striking. Next, I used Blender's text feature and added a solidify to it to make a Boolean to cut in my text. And then finally, I used Trace Genius, which is an add-on I bought, to cut out some image planes of a clown emoji to make the clown Boolean. You can do this with the knife tool, but Trace Genius saves a lot of time, and so I bought it because I do this kind of thing frequently. With those details done, I did one more pass of adding damage around the headstone and focused primarily on the newly done Booleans to make them look a little bit less perfect. Now, this print is a little different than the other ones in the project. I was lucky enough for this one to partner with a sponsor. That sponsor is JLC 3DP. They're actually originally a PCB manufacturer, which means they make integrated circuits, but they've branched out into providing high-quality 3D prints for people. And I was lucky enough to get to try out one of their printing options, which is Resin, which I've actually never printed in before. They make it really easy. They have an online portal where you upload your design, and it gives you a cost quote, so you're not going in blind on price. And they even troubleshoot any issues with the model over email to make sure that your print turns out perfect every time, which they kindly did for me. And I gotta tell you guys, the quality of this thing blew my mind. I have never had anything printed in resin before, and I'm definitely going to do it again with these guys because it really genuinely looks like a product I bought off of a shelf and not something I printed myself. or even had printed at a surface. You can't even see the layer lines. It's honestly mind-boggling. And it was really, really cool to see something I designed in 3D created in this level of quality. It feels like a real product, and I think that's kind of something that's a very special feeling. I'm going to be leaving a link to their information in the video description, so if any of you guys are looking to have something resin printed or printed in FDM in high quality, I would highly recommend checking that out. The headstone was fun, but still pretty simple, and I wanted to challenge myself a bit, so I decided to do a character from a Halloween-themed movie. How hard could it be, right?
Foreshadowing is a narrative device in which suggestions or warnings about events to come are dropped or planted.
After a little bit of searching around, I landed on Oogie Boogie because I love Nightmare Before Christmas. In fact, I watch this movie basically every year on Halloween, which incidentally is one of my favorite holidays. We kind of go a little bit nuts with the decorations at my house most years. The other reason is his character, while fairly organic and dynamic, isn't so complicated that I A, couldn't 3D print it, and B, would get totally stuck trying to sculpt it, since I don't have much experience with character work and I haven't done a ton of sculpting, especially non-hard surface stuff.
Foreshadowing is a narrative device in which
I started off by building a rough outline of the character as a flat plane, one dimension at a time, right? I used that and a mirror modifier to make a very basic base mesh for his body. With the rough shape blocked in, I took a few more passes at shaping the base mesh into something that was approximately right. Then I applied my modifier stack and started shaping the front and back, since they're not quite the same. He's got this big gut on the front and not on the back, obviously.
You know what I'm saying? Gut Cassidy and the Sundance cheeseburger? What?
With the roughing out done, I added an armature and extruded in a very basic skeleton. Now, I don't know a ton about character rigging. In fact, I know almost nothing about character rigging. But luckily, parenting with automatic weights works so well in Blender that for something like this, I didn't have to know much of anything. With my mesh bound to my armature, I roughly posed my character to match the reference, which took a few tries, and I opted to go this route because sculpting the character into this pose would have been, let's be honest, difficult to impossible for a mostly hard surface modeler like me. There are probably ace character modelers out there, maybe there's even some watching this, that could do this in their sleep, but that ain't me. With the character posed, I started sculpting in details. I added his face using the basic subtraction brush. This is probably a good time to mention that I did the sculpting portion of this on my MacBook Pro using Sidecar to extend my display to my iPad. This let me use my iPad and Apple Pencil to do the sculpting as a tablet, essentially. So I could take advantage of features like brush pressure, which honestly made this process so much more natural and approachable, and I think it would have been much harder if I tried to do it just using my mouse. Even with that technology buff, though, I had to start over a few times. Hell, I almost gave up completely at one point. I actually took a break and walked around a bit, which I found can help unstick me when I'm working on something new and challenging. And luckily it worked, because when I came back, I finally got something I was happy with. But this is, try number 2 or 3. I also sculpted in the tears in his seams and used some cloth brushes I found to add wrinkles around the arm and leg joints. These brushes were a lifesaver because I don't think I could have probably sculpted this without it, but the brushes, you just drag the detail right on, which is awesome, and it really makes the model look more dynamic. Finally, I did a basic UV unwrap, just cut his arms off and split him around the main seam. I used the displacement map from a fabric material I already had lying around to control a displacement modifier and add this burlap texture to his body.
Oh my god!
Now, the subdivision level got pretty crazy here, but luckily I'm 3D printing, so it doesn't really matter. Finally, I extruded some cubes, added subdivision modifiers to them, and placed them along the seams to make the stitching. I made the dice by doing some simple booleans and beveling on a cube to make it a little bit rounded and cut these nice little holes. And I finished up by making a cool platform for him by extruding a hexagon, so I have this kind of nice funky shape, and adding some random beveled cuts to it for like these little insets. Then I made some worms out of subdivided cubes, which are just, basic, simple, silly shapes. And I just made little piles out of them in random places. Then I remeshed the entire thing for 3D printing so that it can be a single solid hull mesh and my slicer won't complain, and sent it to my printer. Honestly, for someone who does no character work at all, I'm really happy with how this turned out. Despite being kind of a clown with my timing for this project and biting off way more than I could chew with the character model, I'm actually really proud of the result. And it was really fun pushing my comfort zone and trying stuff I never really get to do. And that's why I always remind you at the end of my videos to never stop learning.